Conserving our genetic resource, where two strategies are very important. First is in situ and second is ex situ conservation. The fundamental objective of genetic resource conservation is the maintenance of broad-based genetic diversity within each of the species, that is, intraspecific genetic diversity with a known or potential value in order to ensure availability for exploitation by present and future generation. There are, broadly speaking, two basic approaches to genetic resources conservation, namely in situ and ex situ conservation methods. In situ conservation means conservation of wildlife in its natural surroundings or in its natural habitat. It ensures protection of the ecosystem of the original habitat and includes protected areas like national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, and biosphere reserves. Ex situ conservation refers to the protection of the species outside their natural habitats in artificial conditions under human care. Examples are botanical garden, zoo, aquarium, parks, agricultural research centers, gene banks, tissue culture, and DNA banks. Wildlife protected areas, that is in situ conservation. So what are the objectives? The objectives of all the protected areas, whether a national park, wildlife sanctuaries, or biosphere reserves, are common. They are protection of natural habitat through controlled, limited use of species. Second, maintenance of viable number of species. Third is establishment and protection of species through legislation for the conservation of wildlife. Fourth is educating the public for wildlife protection. And the fifth point is conducting research in specific areas of wildlife. Coming to the first example of in situ conservation method is national park. So national park is an area set aside by the government strictly for the betterment of the wildlife. Human activities like forestry, grazing, or agriculture is not permitted. Example, Jim Corbett National Park in Uttaranchal is famous for tigers, elephants, leopards, and many species of deer. Kaziranga National Park in Assam is famous for rhinoceros, Indian bison, swamp deer, pygmy hog, etc. Sundarban National Park in West Bengal is famous for Bengal tigers. Kana National Park in Madhya Pradesh is famous for tigers, Barasingha, deer. Second example of in situ conservation method is wildlife sanctuary. It is a protected area that is reserved for the conservation only of wildlife, that is plants and animal species. Human activities like harvesting of timber, collection of minor forest products, and private ownership rights are allowed. Bharatpur Bird Sanctuary in Rajasthan also attracts migratory birds in winter. Gir Lion Sanctuary in Gujarat is famous for Asiatic lions. Kedarnath Sanctuary is famous for brown antler deer. Third example is Biosphere Reserve. It is a special category of protected area of land or coastal environment which aims at conservation of ecosystems and genetic resources contained in them. Multiple land use is permitted by designating various zones, and these zones are natural or core zone, which is the innermost zone where no human activity is allowed and it is legally protected. Second zone is the buffer zone. This is the middle zone of resource use strategies where limited human activities are allowed. The third zone of Biosphere Reserve is transition zone, which is the outermost area of active cooperation between management and the local people. In this zone, activities like settlements, cropping, forestry, recreation, and economic uses are allowed and in harmony with conservation goals. Captive breeding, which is ex situ conservation strategy, and it refers to breeding of animals that are endangered in restricted or captive areas such as zoo, aquariums, research centers, etc. For example, the Nandankanan Zoological Park in Odisha is famous for captive breeding of white tigers and gharial. Advantages of captive breeding. It helps in conserving rare and endangered species. It helps in reintroduction of species in their natural habitat where their number is less. It provides necessary conditions for breeding of animals when their habitat is destroyed, altered, or affected by diseases. It helps in preserving the gene pool to avoid problems of inbreeding. It protects the carrying mother and offspring from predators and natural calamities.